Good afternoon. I'm Tim Renier. I'm excited to present my work on the 2016 presidential election for you today. So this work was carried out at St. Olaf College in Professor Paul Roebuck's Advanced Statistical Modeling class, and I worked with Margaret and Rammah on this project, but as they've graduated and I'm still a senior, they were not able to join me today. So the outcome of this election is obviously a very controversial topic, and a huge variety of people, from pundits to armchair political scientists alike, have a large variety of ideas as to why an unexpected outcome happened. Our goal was to characterize the role of the swing vote in the outcome and to see where the data would lead us in this issue. So the 2016 presidential election was unprecedented in many ways. First off, because of the unusual rhetoric and lack of civility between the candidates, and also because of a large break with traditional party norms. However, as a student of statistics, one of the most interesting things to me is the fact that predictive models failed miserably in their attempts to predict the outcome of the election. So to me, it's very interesting to assess why this might have happened. So we researched hypotheses on the reason the election swung the way it did, both in the political science literature and in common media, as to why this may have happened, and decided to assess two of them using data from a large online survey of verified voters. So the first hypothesis we assessed is that Trump voters tended to be economically downtrodden Americans, and that they flocked to him as a way to bring them out of their economic downtrodden status. Secondly, we also assessed the hypothesis that Trump voters tended to fear minorities and that they signed Trump a way to assuage those fears. So in a typical presidential election, the result is fairly partisan. Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans tend to vote for Republicans. However, an initial look at our data finds something very interesting. So in just looking at political identification and who people voted for, we find that a full 44% of the people who voted for Trump didn't identify as being Republican. This is fascinating, as these are people that are either Democrats who crossed over party lines to vote for Trump, or people who previously chose just not to identify with a political party. That's a huge portion of swing vote, and of course contributed to his win in the election. So it's these people that we seek to characterize. The dataset used in our study contained survey information from almost 45,000 verified voters asking comprehensive questions on demographics and on political identifications and opinions. So to evaluate hypotheses, we constructed a separate model for each individual hypothesis. Now, in deciding how to construct these models, we realized that in a political environment, people don't live in a vacuum. Their political decisions are not made in a vacuum, and they're influenced by the settings that they live in. So we decided it was important to characterize both voters on an individual level and to characterize the political and social environments that surround them. So that's why we chose to use a multi-level random effects model, looking at person-level variables at level 1 and state-level variables at level 2. So when we assess the importance of a variable in our model, we use a likelihood ratio test as a criteria between nested models of the model containing said variable and a null model without it, with the threshold for statistical significance being a p-value of less than 0.05. We also considered all possible interactions between variables in the model and eliminated them if the change in the model was not statistically significant. Now, first I'll walk you through our first hypothesis, that Trump voters tended to be economically downtrodden Americans. In this model, we considered a number of variables at level 1 and at level 2, including family income, one's view on the economy, whether or not they believed that the economy had gotten better, stayed the same, or had gotten worse under President Obama, their education status, highest education level, whether they identified as being Republican or something else, and also affiliation either with them or a family member with a union. At level 2, we considered state median income and the proportion of people in each state belonging to a union. Now, this level 2 variable didn't come from the survey. It actually came from census information and was matched with each person based on their identified state in the data set. Let's start by looking at level 1 variables. Evaluating a simple relationship between income and vote choice, this is fascinating to find that contrary to some popular beliefs, the median income among Trump voters versus those who voted for another candidate was both about $55,000. They were very close to being the same. With respect to union status, it appeared that about an even proportion of each candidate's votership came from people belonging or affiliated in some way with a union. Now, in evaluating the outlook of voters on the economy, this is a relationship that's a bit less surprising based on intuition. About 60% of those who voted for Trump believed that the economy got worse under President Obama, which isn't all that surprising and could be just a very partisan thing in that Republicans believed that a Democrat did a bad job of running the economy. Also evaluating education status, a larger percentage of people who voted for Trump tended to not have a college education compared to those who voted for another candidate. However, this difference isn't also substantial. So now let's examine the level 2 variables, the state level variables. We observed that state median income among voters for Trump tended to be a little bit lower than it did for those who voted for another candidate, although this isn't substantially different and was consistent with the lack of difference in median income on the individual level. And when evaluating the proportion of people in each state belonging to a union, we find that Trump voters tended to come from states with actually a lower percentage of people belonging to unions than those who voted for other candidates. But again, this isn't starkly different. After all variables were considered in all possible interactions, this is what we see here is the final model we settled on for this economically driven hypothesis. And one of the most interesting things is the fact that family income was not a significant predictor of vote for Trump. Now, it's included here because of an interesting interaction it has with econ worse, the variable describing whether someone believed the economy got worse under President Obama. So the interpretation of this is very interesting in that what we find is that the effect of believing the economy was worse under Obama is that there's a 6.5% higher odds of voting for Trump for each additional $10,000 in family income. And that's after adjusting for state median income, education status, and political party. Whereas the effect was only 0.2% increase in odds of voting for Trump for each additional $10,000 in family income if you didn't believe the economy had gotten worse. So believing the economy had gotten worse interacted significantly with your income to help predict whether you would vote for Trump. So then another fascinating observation came from the interaction between view on the economy, whether it got worse under President Obama, and political party identification, whether you would identify as Republican or something else. So this observation is that after adjusting for all other variables, people who didn't identify as Republican, if they believed the economy has gotten worse under President Obama, would have a 10.7 times increase in odds of voting for Trump. And this is opposed to for Republicans who believed the economy had gotten worse, a 4.7 times increase in odds of voting for Trump. Now, this seems strange that the effect of believing the economy had gotten worse was greater on predicting Trump vote for people who weren't Republican. But a view of this plot over here helps to make some sense of what happens here, and it has a lot to do with the fact that people who identified as Republican voted for Trump regardless of their view on the economy. But what we see with the swing voters, these non-Republicans, is fascinating. So, of non-Republicans, 61% of those who believed the economy had gotten worse under President Obama voted for Trump. This is a very substantial proportion, as opposed to only 13% of people who believed the economy didn't get worse under President Obama voted for Trump. So what this tells us is that you essentially, to be a non-Republican who voted for Trump, you essentially had to believe the economy got worse. Now, this shows the power of his rhetoric in this sense, in that while looking at pure economic data, our hypothesis that the people who voted for Trump, or swing voters who voted for Trump, would be economically downtrodden wasn't supported per se. This hypothesis is mediated by view on the economy and alignment of one with Trump's belief that the economy had gotten worse under President Obama. All right, so now let's move on to the second hypothesis, which is that Trump voters tended to vote for Trump because they feared minorities. Now, we're going to go ahead and call this the minority politics model, as there's a number of variables that are sort of complex in this situation but help to approach this issue. So at the first level, at the person level, we assessed support for anti-immigrant policies on the survey. There were a number of specific policy questions asked, but these were recoded into a single yes, no, anti-immigrant or non-anti-immigrant variable. Additionally, we looked at evangelical Christian status, as this was a particular audience that Trump played to during his campaign, specifically with the fear of religious minorities coming into the country. And additionally, also looking at Republican status to control for differences in political party. And then at level 2, the state level variable, again deriving from census information, we decided to look at the state proportion of the population being foreign born, and also the proportion of the population that was actually minority. So just looking at an overall view of the data, we see looking at anti-immigrant the support of anti-immigrant policies put forth by President Trump. Of course, 89% of people who voted for Trump agreed with those policies, indicating that you essentially had to agree with those policies to vote for President Trump. But this, again, could be just a partisan issue. Also looking at evangelical Christian status, we see that a larger proportion of Trump's voters were evangelical Christians, or identifying that way at least, than voting for other candidates. But it was not as large of a difference as the media might have made it to sound to be. Also, when looking at the association between the percent foreign-born population in a given state and one's vote, looking at the log odds plotted here, generally we see that as the proportion of people in a state who are foreign-born increases, the odds of voting for Trump tends to decrease. However, this might just be as much of a characterization of the fact that people who are foreign-born may vote less for Trump, and in a state with more people who are foreign-born voting, their opinion happens to get expressed more in the vote. However, this is an important association to consider in the future. So this is the final model for the minority politics model, again after assessing all of the variables that we considered and considering all possible interactions. And every variable is astonishingly significant in this model. And there's a lot of interesting interpretations that can be gleaned from this. So the few main things is that even after adjusting for all variables in the model, we do see that there's a 12% decrease in odds of voting for Trump for each additional 10% of a state's population being foreign-born, which of course would indicate support for this hypothesis. Also, we found that people who identified as evangelical Christians, after adjusting for all other variables in the model, had a 1.82 times increase in odds of voting for President Trump. However, that's something that wasn't unexpected given a lot of the rhetoric in the media. But another interesting relationship, similar to something we saw in the in the economic model, came from the interaction between political party and support of anti-immigrant policies, in that Republicans, after adjusting for all other variables, when they supported these anti-immigrant policies, only had a 5.4 times increase in odds of voting for Trump, whereas non-Republicans had a huge increase in odds of voting for Trump if they supported anti-immigrant policies at 10.2 times. And again, this is a bit confusing and doesn't make a lot of sense right away, but again, when we break it down and look at the characteristics of swing voters versus those who are identifying as Republicans, sort of adjusting for the fact that there's a partisan effect here, being that Republicans will tend to vote for Republicans even if they don't necessarily believe with President Trump's ideas, we see here that among those who are not Republican, who are at least not identify as being Republican, 41% who expressed anti-immigrant sentiments or supported anti-immigrant policies had voted for President Trump, 41% of that group, whereas only 6% of people who did not support anti-immigrant policies, who were in that swing vote category, voted for President Trump. So that shows us that essentially everyone who was a swing voter must have supported at least been okay with Trump's anti-immigrant policies. And that illustrates a tremendous power of his rhetoric and the fact that voters simply came to align with his policies. And this hypothesis is supported in many ways because of this. And one of the common discussions in the election was the issue of whether Trump was actually a strong candidate, or whether it was just that Hillary Clinton was a rather weak candidate and that Trump was successful because of that. And this strong recruitment of people to his ideals who are not Republicans and then who in turn agree with his ideas and then vote with him suggests that Trump's rhetoric genuinely resonated with people, and that strongly influenced the results of the election. And of course, there are a number of limitations to this work, and the first is that Trump's vote was actually underrepresented in the survey sample. So the survey accounted for only 40% of voters voting for Trump, where nationally he had 46% of the popular vote. But this is actually likely typical of a lot of polls, and is possibly one of the reasons why his true votership was underestimated in polling. There's also the risk of missing data influencing the results, as the survey required that people complete questionnaires both before and after the election, and some people didn't follow up with that data. And of course, there's always potential bias in the fact that not everyone's going to respond to the survey, and it's hard to characterize who is not responding to a survey. Additionally, when we look at the state level variables at level 2, we assume a certain homogeneity among states. And as you look at this electoral map by county, vote for Trump or Clinton by county, you can see that states clearly aren't homogeneous, especially for states that have a fairly even urban-rural divide. So that assumption is not perfect, but for the constraints of what we were working with, was important to make. Also, because of the complexity of the model, we were not able to include a large number of random effects in the model. However, we don't believe that this was a strongly negative aspect of our study. So in conclusion, first of all, we find that while Republican Party lines were largely followed, Republicans tended to vote for Trump, there was a substantial proportion of non-Republicans, either Democrats or people who previously didn't identify with a party, who did vote for Trump. These are the swing voters we were interested in characterizing. And these people could be characterized almost entirely by support of anti-immigrant policies and belief that the economy was getting worse. So if you weren't a Republican, you essentially had to believe in these two aspects of his rhetoric to vote for Trump, whereas if you didn't align with these ideas, it was very unlikely that you would vote for Trump. So what we see is also in this partial support for our hypothesis that economically downtrodden people tended to vote for Trump, and that while pure economic or pure income isn't necessarily associated with voting for Trump, that interaction is mediated by belief on the status of the economy. And we did find support for a second hypothesis with the minority politics model, that Trump voters did indeed tend to align with policies that suggested fear of minorities and immigrants. So finally, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope that you enjoyed hearing about this work.